Welcome everyone to our deep dive into some pivotal moments in Cuban-American history. Today we'll explore the intricacies of the Cuban-American Treaty of Relations, delve into Cuba's unique role in World War II, and uncover the complex history of Guantanamo Bay. These topics are not just historical footnotes. They have shaped the geopolitical landscape of the Western Hemisphere and continue to influence relations between the United States and Cuba today. We'll start by examining the Cuban-American Treaty of Relations, signed in 1934, which redefined the relationship between the two nations and marked a shift away from the Platt Amendment. We'll then move on to Cuba's strategic importance during World War II, highlighting how this Caribbean nation contributed to the Allied efforts and navigated the turbulent waters of wartime politics. Finally, we'll trace the evolution of Guantanamo Bay from its early days as a naval base to its current controversial status, exploring how it has become a symbol of both strategic military importance and human rights debates. Join me as we journey through these significant historical events, shedding light on the complex interplay of diplomacy, war, and politics that continue to resonate in today's world. Thank you for being here, and let's embark on this historical adventure together. Let's start with a brief history of Cuba. Following its defeat in the Spanish-American War and the Cuban War of Independence, Spain dropped all claims to Cuba under the terms of the 1898 Treaty of Paris. By the way, the red arrow points to the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. William McKinley was the 25th President of the United States from 1897 until his assassination in 1901. During his presidency, McKinley led the nation to victory in the Spanish-American War, raised protective tariffs to promote American industry, and kept the nation on the gold standard in a rejection of free silver, effectively expansionary monetary policy. In the political atmosphere in the U.S. growing out of the Cuban struggle for independence, McKinley, on 11 April 1898, asked the Congress to authorize and empower the President to take measures to ensure in Cuba the establishment of a stable government capable of maintaining order and observing its international obligations, ensuring peace and tranquility and the security of its citizens as well as our own, and to use the military and naval forces of the United States as may be necessary for these purposes. During the Spanish-American War, the United States maintained a large military arsenal in Cuba to protect U.S. holdings and to mediate Spanish-Cuban relations. In 1899, the McKinley administration settled on occupation as its response to the appearance of a revolutionary government in Cuba following the end of Spanish control. During the Spanish-American War, the United States maintained a large military arsenal in Cuba to protect U.S. holdings and to mediate Spanish-Cuban relations. In 1899, the McKinley administration settled on occupation as its response to the appearance of a revolutionary government in Cuba following the end of Spanish control. The Teller Clause quelled any anxiety of annexation by stating that the United States hereby disclaims any disposition of intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over Cuba except for pacification thereof, and asserts its determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people. The Teller Amendment was enacted on April the 20th, 1898. Just imagine how the 20th century would have been different had the United States annexed Cuba. No Bay of Pigs, no missile crisis, no Castro, all great in hindsight. The Platt Amendment was an addition to the earlier Teller Amendment, which had previously limited United States involvement in Cuba relating to its treatment after the Spanish-American War, particularly in preventing its annexation, which had been proposed by various expansionist political entities within the United States. Senator Teller himself had a history of opposing American imperialism, criticizing the American campaigns in Panama and the Philippines. Yet in 1894 he had been an arch expansionist supporting potential plans to annex Cuba, and Teller would go on to support the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment was introduced to Congress by Senator Orville H. Platt on February 25, 1901. On March 2, 1901, the Platt Amendment was passed as part of the 1901 Army Appropriations Bill. It stipulated 7 conditions for the withdrawal of United States troops remaining in Cuba at the end of the Spanish-American War, and an 8th condition that Cuba sign a treaty accepting these 7 conditions. The 7 conditions of the Platt Amendment. Number 1. Not permit a foreign power to obtain a naval base on the island. Number 2. Not go into excessive debt. Number 3. Grant the United States the right to intervene in Cuba for the maintenance of an adequate government. Number 4. Approve all prior military actions by the United States. Number 5. Take measures to reduce infectious diseases. Number 6. Determine sovereignty over the Isle of Pines by a later treaty. Number 7. Lease lands for naval stations to the United States. On May 22, 1901, Cuba entered into a treaty with the United States to make the same required 7 pledges. On December 25, 1901, Cuba, under pressure from the USA, amended its constitution to contain, word for word, the 7 applicable demands of the Platt Amendment. United States President Theodore Roosevelt withdrew federal troops from Cuba in 1902. Cuba then signed the treaty the next year, after which Cuba executed a lease of land to the United States for a coaling and naval station at Guantanamo Bay. Originally, the United States would have been able to build 4 military bases, but Cuba managed to negotiate this down to 2, those being Guantanamo and Bahia Honda, which was traded in 1912 for more land at Guantanamo. This was a surprise, given that Secretary Root had indicated his wish for the United States to become the owner and enforcer of Cuba's waterfront while the Platt Amendment was being drafted. In summary, United States law directed the president to cede control of Cuba to its government only when that government had endorsed the 7 provisions established in U.S. law by the Platt Amendment of March 1901. The 1903 Treaty of Relations noted that Cuba's Constitutional Convention had, on June 12, 1901, added the Platt Amendment provisions to its constitution on February the 21st, 1901. Those provisions, among other things, restricted the independence of the Cuban government and gave the United States the right to oversee and at times interfere in Cuban affairs. The Cuban government had taken power, and the United States withdrew its forces as of May 20th, 1902. The final provision of the Platt Amendment required that its other provisions be adopted by treaty as well. The Treaty of Relations, signed in May 1903, accomplished this task. The second occupation of Cuba by United States military forces, officially the Provisional Government of Cuba, lasted from September 1906 to February 1909. The 1903 Treaty of Relations was used as the justification. When the government of Cuban President Tomás Estrada Palma collapsed, United States President Theodore Roosevelt ordered U.S. military forces into Cuba. Their mission was to prevent fighting between the Cubans, to protect U.S. economic interests there, and to hold free elections in order to establish a new and legitimate government. Following the election of José Miguel Gómez in November 1908, U.S. officials judged the situation in Cuba sufficiently stable for the U.S. to withdraw its troops, a process that was completed in February 1909. In 1934, a new Treaty of Relations replaced the 1903 Treaty of Relations. However, the events that transpired in the decades after, such as the overthrow of the standing Cuban government, caused the United States government to reevaluate and revise the initial treaty in the form of the Cuban-American Treaty of Relations of 1934. The purpose of this was to maintain that Cuba would agree to recognize all prior United States military actions as lawful and allow the United States to maintain and be able to quarantine their naval base, but to also nullify the provisions of the 1903 treaty, whereby the involvement of the United States in the affairs of the Cuban government impeded the sovereignty of Cuba. Because of Cuba's geographical position at the entrance of the Gulf of Mexico, Havana's role as the principal trading port in the West Indies, and the country's natural resources, Cuba was an important participant in the American theater of World War II. Cuba was one of the greatest beneficiaries of the United States Lend-Lease program. President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease bill into law on March 11, 1941. It permitted him to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of to any such government whose defense the President deems vital to the defense of the United States, any defense article. Federico Laredo Bru was the Cuban president when the war began. His only significant crisis related to the war before he left office in 1940 was the MS St. Louis affair. The MS St. Louis was a German ocean liner that was carrying over 900 Jewish refugees from Germany to Cuba. Upon her arrival in Havana, the Cuban government refused to allow the refugees to land because they did not have proper permits and visas. After the ocean liner sailed north, the governments of both the United States and Canada also refused to accept the refugees, and so the St. Louis sailed back across the Atlantic and dropped the passengers off in Europe. Some went to Britain, but most went to Belgium and France, which were soon overrun by German forces. Though the United States had been a dominant force in Cuban politics since 1898, causing anti-American sentiment among the educated, the U.S. presence was lessened under Bru. After the 1940 Cuban elections, Bru was succeeded by the strongman-in-chief of the Cuban army, Fulgencio Batista. At first, the United States was concerned about Batista's intentions on whether he would align his country with the Axis or the Allies. Batista, shortly after becoming president, legalized a pro-fascist organization linked to Francisco Franco and his regime in Spain. But fear of any Nazi sympathies of Batista was dispelled when he sent the British a large quantity of sugar as a gift. Later, fear of any possible sympathy for Franco was also dispelled when he suggested to the United States that it launch a joint U.S.-Latin American invasion of Spain to overthrow Franco and his regime, but the plan did not materialize. Batista's support for the Allied cause was confirmed in February 1941 when he ordered all German and Italian consular officials to leave his country. Cuba entered the war on December 9, 1941, by declaring war on Japan, which had launched a devastating attack on the United States Navy base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, 2 days earlier. Cuba declared war on Germany and Italy on December 11, 1941, and following the Americans, broke relations with Vichy France on November 10, 1942. Let's take a look at Cuban participation in the Battle of the Caribbean. On June 18, 1941, the United States established Naval Air Facility La Fe, Cuba. The U.S. naval code word for La Fe was humpback. U.S. Navy bases in Cuba fell under the command of the Gulf Sea Frontier, headquartered at Miami, Florida, after a brief stint based at Key West. In June 26th, the United States also established Naval Air Auxiliary Station San Julian, slightly to the east of La Fe, Cuba. This was in response to Nazi Germany announcing unrestricted submarine warfare off the Atlantic coast of the United States. Specifically, the United States Navy recognized the need to augment anti-submarine patrols in the Yucatan Channel. Naval Air Station San Julian was established on the western tip of Cuba near Pan American World Airways' Isabel Rubio Emergency Landing Field. By September 7th, Cuba and United States had signed a new naval and military agreement of cooperation. The strategic importance of Cuba for the air and maritime communications of United States and the importance of its production of sugar obliged them to reinforce the island. The Pinar del Rio area was considered ideally situated for further development, and the Army began construction by expanding the existing Pan American airfield on November 1st. A second air base was negotiated between Cuba and the United States and known as San Antonio de los Baños Airfield. The air base was also known as the Cayuga, was built near a town of the same name in the Havana province by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and the San Julian Air Base in the Guanahacabibes Peninsula in Pinar del Rio was also built. The United States flew patrols in the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico to hunt German submarines. The U.S. Air Force flew out of San Antonio de los Baños, and the U.S. Navy used San Julian. Both the San Antonio de los Baños airfield and the San Julian Air Base were turned over to the Cuban military after the war. Continuing on with our discussion of Cuba and the Battle of the Caribbean, the Cuban Navy escorted hundreds of Allied ships through hostile waters, sailed nearly 400,000 miles on convoy and patrol duty, flew over 83,000 hours on convoy and patrol duty, and rescued over 200 U-boat victims from the sea, all without losing a single warship or aircraft to enemy action. The photo shows a former U.S. Coast Guard 83-foot type patrol launch transferred to Cuba by the Lend-Lease program. Ernest Hemingway lived in Cuba during the early years of World War II. In 1940, he and his third wife, Martha Gellhorn, purchased a home outside Havana called Finca Vigia, Lookout Farm. They lived there for the next 20 years. He was living there when the Battle of the Caribbean started in 1941. His first contribution to the Allied war effort without leaving the island was to organize his own counterintelligence force to root out any Axis spies operating in Havana. Calling it his crook factory, Hemingway's unit consisted of 18 men, many of whom he had worked with 5 years before during the Spanish Civil War. Hemingway's crook factory effort was unsuccessful, and he soon turned his attention to fighting the German U-boats operating in the Caribbean Sea. Just 3 weeks after receiving permission from Ambassador Spruill Braden to form the crook factory, Hemingway asked Braden for permission to arm his fishing boat, the Pilar, for patrols against U-boats off of the Cuban coast. Surprisingly, Braden gave Hemingway permission, and then proceeded with arming the Pilar and the crew with machine guns, bazookas, and hand grenades. Hemingway's plan was to sail around in what appeared to be a harmless pleasure craft, inviting the Germans to surface and board. When they did, the boarding party would be disposed of with the machine guns, and the U-boat would then be engaged with the bazookas and grenades. Hemingway's patrols against German U-boats turned out to be just as unsuccessful as the counterintelligence operation was. As the months passed and as no U-boat appeared, the Pilar's patrols turned into fishing trips, and the grenades were thrown into the sea as drunken sport. After adding his sons Patrick and Gregory to the crew, Hemingway acknowledged that his U-boat hunting venture had turned into a charade, but he never really admitted it. Years later, a Cuban naval officer, Mario Ramirez Delgado, who sank U-176, said Hemingway was a playboy that hunted submarines off the Cuban coast as a whim. Let's turn our attention to Guantanamo Bay. The area surrounding Guantanamo Bay was originally inhabited by the Taino people, as were most Caribbean islands at the time of European contact in the late 15th century. In 1494, Christopher Columbus, on his second voyage, arrived and spent the night. The place where Columbus landed is now known as Fisherman's Point. Columbus declared the bay Puerto Grande. The bay and surrounding areas came under British control during the War of Jenkins' Ear. The War of Jenkins' Ear, known as Guerra del Asiento in Spain, was a conflict between Britain and Spain lasting from 1739 to 1748, with major operations largely ended by 1742. Its unusual name, coined by Thomas Carlyle in 1858, refers to an ear severed from Robert Jenkins, a captain of a British merchant ship. There is no evidence that supports the stories that the severed ear was exhibited before the British Parliament. Prior to British occupation, the bay was referred to as Waltham Harbour. The British renamed the bay Cumberland Bay. The British retreated from the area after a failed attempt to march to Santiago de Cuba. The U.S. fleet attacking Santiago secured Guantanamo's harbor for protection during the hurricane season of 1898. The Marines landed at Guantanamo Bay with naval support, and American and Cuban forces routed the defending Spanish troops. The war ended with the Treaty of Paris of 1898, in which Spain formally relinquished control of Cuba. Although the war was over, the United States maintained a strong military presence on the island. Let's go back to the Platt Amendment that I discussed at the beginning of this presentation, the 1903 lease of U.S. naval bases in Cuba. Article 1 describes the boundaries of the areas being leased, Guantanamo Bay and Bahia Honda. Article 2. The U.S. may occupy, use, and modify the properties to fit the needs of a coaling and naval station only. Vessels in the Cuban trade shall have free passage. Article 3. Cuba retains ultimate sovereignty. But during the occupation, the U.S. exercises sole jurisdiction over the areas described in Article 1. Under conditions to be agreed on, the U.S. has the right to acquire, by purchase or eminent domain, any land included therein. The second part of the 1903 lease was signed 5 months later in July 1903 and consisted of the following provisions. Annual rent. The United States agreed to pay Cuba an annual sum of $2,000 in gold coin as long as it occupied the leased areas. Land acquisition. All private lands within the leased areas were to be acquired by the Republic of Cuba, with the United States covering the costs. Boundaries. The leased areas were to be clearly marked with permanent fences or enclosures, with the United States bearing the expenses for construction and maintenance. Commercial restrictions. No commercial, industrial, or other enterprises were allowed within the leased areas. Fugitive extradition. Both countries agreed to extradite fugitives from justice charged with crimes or misdemeanors amenable to the other country's laws. Customs exemptions. Materials and merchandise imported into the leased areas for exclusive use were exempt from customs duties and other fees. This lease was part of the broader Cuban-American Treaty of Relations, 1903, which included the Platt Amendment provisions that restricted Cuba's independence and allowed the United States to intervene in Cuban affairs. Signed Theodore Roosevelt and Jose M. Garcia Montes. In 1934, the United States unilaterally changed the payment from gold coin to US dollars per the Gold Reserve Act. The lease amount was set at $3,386 based on the price of gold at the time. In 1973, the U.S. adjusted the lease amount to $3,676, and in 1974 to $4,085, based on further increases to the price of gold in U.S. dollars. Payments have been sent annually, but only one lease payment has been accepted since the Cuban Revolution, and Fidel Castro claimed that this check was deposited due to confusion in 1959. The Cuban government has not deposited any other lease checks since that time. In case you are wondering, the 1903 lease for Guantanamo has no fixed expiration date. By 1916, the base was already operational and serving as a strategic location for the U.S. Navy in the Caribbean. During World War II, Guantanamo Bay played a significant role as an anti-submarine warfare base. The U.S. Navy used the base to monitor and protect the Caribbean Sea from German U-boats. The base was also expanded to include airport facilities to accommodate carrier groups and patrol squadrons. Additionally, Guantanamo Bay served as a logistical hub for the U.S. Navy, providing support for naval operations in the region. The base's strategic location made it an essential part of the United States' efforts to secure the Caribbean and protect merchant shipping convoys from New York City and Key West to the Panama Canal. Its greatest worth is as an isolated warm water training base for the fleet. During World War II, the base was set up to use a nondescript number for postal operations. The base used the Fleet Post Office Atlantic in New York City with the address 115FPONY. Let's now look at the post-World War II period. Until the 1953 to 59 revolution, thousands of Cubans commuted daily from outside the base to jobs within. In mid-1958, vehicular traffic was stopped. Workers were required to walk through the base's several gates. Public Works Center buses were pressed into service almost overnight to carry the tides of workers to and from the gate. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the families of military personnel were evacuated from the base. Notified of the evacuation on 22nd October, evacuees were told to pack one suitcase per family member, to bring evacuation and immunization cards, to tie pets in the yard, to leave the keys to the house on the dining table, and to wait in front of the house for buses. Dependents traveled to the airfield for flights to the United States or to ports for passage aboard evacuation ships. After the crisis was resolved, family members were allowed to return to the base in December 1962. From 1939, the base's water was supplied by pipelines that drew water from the Yateras River about 4.5 miles northeast of the base. The U.S. government paid a fee for this. In 1964, the fee was about $14,000 a month for about 2.5 million U.S. gallons per day. In 1964, the Cuban government stopped the flow. The base had about 14 million gallons of water in storage, and strict water conservation was put into effect immediately. The US first imported water from Jamaica by barge, then relocated a desalination plant from San Diego. When the Cuban government accused the United States of stealing water, Base Commander John D. Bulkley ordered that the pipelines be cut and a section removed. A 38-inch length of the 14-inch diameter pipe and a 20-inch length of the 10-inch diameter pipe were lifted from the ground and the openings sealed. This photo shows the main entrance to the base today. Here is a photo of the northeast gate at Guantanamo that separates the base from Cuba. The facilities at Guantanamo Bay have over 8,000 US sailors and Marines stationed there. It is the only military base the US maintains in a communist country. In 2005, the US Navy completed a $12 million wind power project at the base for electrical generation. By 2006, only two elderly Cubans, Luis de la Rosa and Harry Henry, still cross the base's northeast gate daily to work on the base because the Cuban government prohibited new recruitment since its revolution. They both retired at the end of 2012. Cactus curtain is a term describing the line separating the naval base from Cuban-controlled territory. After the Cuban Revolution, some Cubans sought refuge on the Guantanamo Bay naval base. In the fall of 1961, Cuban troops planted an 8-mile barrier of Opuntia cactus along the northeastern section of the 17-mile fence surrounding the base to stop Cubans from escaping Cuba to take refuge in the United States. US and Cuban troops placed some 55,000 landmines across the no man's land around the perimeter of the naval base, creating the second largest minefield in the world and the largest in the Western Hemisphere. On 16 May 1996, US President Bill Clinton ordered the demining of the American field. They have since been replaced with motion and sound sensors to detect intruders on the base. The Cuban government has not removed its corresponding minefield outside the perimeter. In the last quarter of the 20th century, the base was used to house Cuban and Haitian refugees intercepted on the high seas. In the early 1990s, it held refugees who fled Haiti after military forces overthrew President Jean-Bertrand Aristide. These refugees were held in a detainment area called Camp Bulkley until U.S. District Court Judge Sterling Johnson, Jr. declared the camp unconstitutional on the 8th of June, 1993. This decision was later vacated. The last Haitian migrants departed Guantanamo on the 1st of November 1995. Let's turn our attention to Guantanamo Bay as a detention camp. It is not my intention in this presentation to discuss in great detail the political and legal ramifications surrounding the detention camp. The Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp is a United States military prison located within Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, also referred to as Guantanamo G-Bay, GTMO, and Gitmo. At the time of its establishment in January of 2002, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said the detention camp was established to detain extraordinarily dangerous people, to interrogate detainees in an optimal setting, and to prosecute detainees for war crimes. The Department of Defense at first kept secret the identity of the individuals held in Guantanamo, but after losing attempts to defy a Freedom of Information Act request, the U.S. military officially acknowledged holding 779 prisoners in the camp. The facility is operated by the Joint Task Force Guantanamo of the United States government in Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. Detention areas consisted of Camp Delta, including Camp Echo, Camp Iguana and Camp X-Ray, which is now closed. Guantanamo detention camp has and always will be a political hot potato. The term war criminals is very misleading. What war are we referring to, and what country have we declared war on? Of course, war refers to the war on terrorism, a battle against individuals hell-bent on attacking the United States. In retrospect, a new form of detention facility was warranted for these terrorists. The question remains, though, are they guilty or just innocent bystanders? The camp was established by U.S. President George W. Bush's administration in 2002 during the War on Terror. His successor, President Barack Obama, promised that he would close it, but met strong bipartisan opposition from the U.S. Congress. Laws were passed to prohibit detainees from Guantanamo being imprisoned on U.S. soil. During Obama's administration, the number of inmates was reduced from about 245 to 41. Most former detainees were freed and transferred to other countries. In January 2018, President Donald Trump signed an executive order to keep the detention camp open indefinitely. In May 2018, the first prisoner was transferred during Trump's term. This reduced the number of inmates to 40. The Biden administration made efforts to reduce the number of detainees at Guantanamo Bay. By the end of his term, the population was reduced to its lowest level ever, with only 15 detainees remaining. This was achieved through the release of nearly a dozen detainees to Oman. Here is a photo of the interior of the camp. This photo shows the items issued to each detainee. President Obama said he intended to close the detention camp and planned to bring detainees to the United States to stand trial by the end of his first term in office. On 22 January 2009, he issued 3 executive orders. Only one of these explicitly dealt with policy at the Guantanamo Bay detention camp and directed the camp's closure within 1 year. All 3 could have possibly impacted the detention center, as well as how the United States holds detainees. This plan was thwarted for the time being on May 20, 2009, when the United States Senate voted to keep the prison at Guantanamo Bay open for the foreseeable future and forbid the transfer of any detainees to facilities in the United States. The detention center is still in operation. At the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2013, Cuba's foreign minister demanded that the U.S. return the base and the usurped territory, which the Cuban government considers to be occupied since the U.S. invasion of Cuba during the Spanish-American War in 1898. Harbor security at Guantanamo Bay is a critical aspect of the base's operations. The base is surrounded by a 17.4-mile fence, and both U.S. Marines and Cuba's Frontier Brigade patrol the fence line 24 hours a day. Harbor security works with the U.S. Coast Guard to patrol and ensure the safety of the waters surrounding the base. There are 2 airfields within the base, Leeward Point Field and McCalla Field. Leeward Point Field, also known as Leeward Airfield, is the active military airfield, constructed in 1953 as part of Naval Air Station Guantanamo Bay. The airfield has 1 asphalt runway designated 1028, which is 8,000 feet long at an elevation of 56 feet above mean sea level. On August 18, 1993, a DC-8 freighter crashed at Leeward Point Field, but fortunately all 3 crew members survived. McCalla Field was established in 1931 but ceased operations around 1970. It was repurposed during the Cuban and Haitian refugee crises in the 1990s, with refugee camps set up on the former runways. The airfield is no longer used for aviation purposes. It has been used for various other purposes, including housing the Camp Justice Tent City for lawyers involved in the Guantanamo military commissions. By the way, Naval Air Station Guantanamo Bay was officially established 1st February 1941 and is still operational. Life on base includes all the comforts of home. A Baskin-Robbins ice cream stand opened in the 1980s. In early 1986, the base added the first and only McDonald's restaurant within Cuba. A Subway restaurant was opened in 2002. There's also a cafe that sells Baskin-Robbins ice cream and Starbucks coffee, and there is a combined KFC and Taco Bell restaurant. All the restaurants on the base are franchises owned and operated by the Department of the Navy. These restaurants are inside the base, so are not accessible to Cubans. The photo shows a street of military housing that looks like it came straight out of Middle America. The golf course at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base is known as the Lateral Hazard Golf Course. It's a 9-hole course with rocky terrain. The greens are quite small and require players to bring patches of artificial turf to hit shots. Professional golfer John Fine, shown in the photo, helps service members with their golf game. Fine was brought to the naval station by the base Morale, Welfare and Recreation Program to provide free golf lessons. The Cooper Field Athletic Complex at Guantanamo is a comprehensive sports and recreation facility for command physical training, physical health assessments, and intramural sports. The complex includes 2 turf softball fields, 1 turf football/soccer field, 1 youth turf baseball field, and 1 multi-purpose turf field. There are also 4 tennis courts, a beach volleyball court, an outdoor basketball court, and an outdoor leisure track. You'll find batting cages, a skate park, a putt-putt course, and the first Navy outdoor pickleball park. Thank you for watching, and we hope you enjoyed this presentation on our relationship with Cuba. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel by pressing the subscribe button below. We are planning to add many more presentations covering a wide variety of science, history, and other enriching subjects. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please feel free to make them, and we will do our best to respond. Again, thanks for watching, and please do subscribe.